Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Steve Barnes. For this episode, we'll be joined by Barbara Lee, the U.S. Representative for California's 13th Congressional District. Congresswoman Lee is a Democrat and has served in the House since being first elected in 1998. And among her committee and subcommittee assignments, she's a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee. She'll be speaking with us for this episode about reparations. Her views as expressed are her own. Congresswoman Lee, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have you here at Penn Law. Welcome. And you're here with us today and tonight for the 2016 Higginbotham Lecture, an annual lecture in honor of the renowned federal judge A. Leon Higginbotham, who, as you know, was also a professor here. Tonight you'll be speaking with our community about reparations. So if you could please, for the benefit of our Case in Point audience, what is your perspective on reparations, please?
Sure. Well, let me say I'm really happy to be here. And just so honored to be here in the memory and legacy of Judge Higginbotham. He is truly a legend and was a great leader. I'm going to talk tonight about some of the advances and accomplishments of the Obama administration in spite of the obstruction of Republican Congress. But also I want to talk about where we must go from here as it relates to the new front on the civil rights and human rights movement. Several weeks ago, I attended the opening of the National Museum on African American History and Culture, and it is quite an amazing museum. Everyone in this country needs to go visit that museum because it puts in perspective the context in which African Americans and people of color live now in this country. The president said it, I think, so brilliantly at the opening. It puts into the current context into the historical circumstances and conditions upon which we see ourselves now. And I think it's important because when you look at the Middle Passage, the slave trade, the legacy of slavery, the vestiges of that period are still with us. All you have to do is look at the lynchings, Jim Crow laws, segregation now, mass incarceration. You look at the huge disparities in healthcare and employment, in housing. You know, there's a factor of race always in all of these disparities. And so while race is not the only factor, it is a huge factor when you look at the African American community in terms of gaps and disparities. And so what do we do? Where do we go from here? The Obama administration has left an amazing legacy. And we have to now move forward, take that baton and go forward. And we have to have a debate about reparations because, you know, it's controversial, not so much as it was years ago, but Congressman Conyers has been trying for years and years to put forth H.R. 40, which is strictly a bill to look at establishing a commission to study reparations and what that would mean. Recently, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights issued a report, and it looked at the issues around African Americans in America and the Caribbean and what needs to happen for justice for everyone in terms of equal opportunity. And they laid forth a plan and some ideas on how to move forward, and that included reparations. I have been the United Nations representative for 2 sessions now from the House of Representatives, and I have looked at much of what is taking place at the United Nations as it relates to people of African descent, and I think it's about time now that this country, everyone, begin to understand that while, yes, an apology for that horrible, horrific legacy of slavery is needed, we have to move forward and do some things that are new, that are different, and there are movements now such as Black Lives Matter that are out there telling us and giving us some direction on what needs to happen next.
What are the mechanisms by which you would move forward, whether through legislation or through civil society movements and so forth? Would it be through H.R. 40 or would it be through another means?
I think there are a variety of means. I think at the federal level, H.R. 40, what that does is establish a commission to really determine what the means are. But in the meantime, some of the universities, look at Georgetown, for example, you know, some are beginning to really come to grips with their role in the whole transatlantic slave trade and are doing some things immediately to try to rectify that. I think they need to move a little further by, you know, making sure that there are scholarships and other forms of reparations for the descendants of those who lost everything, including their families, and haven't caught up yet in order to live the American dream. And so some of the universities, some insurance companies, this has been going on for a while, but I think right now we need a federal foundation and a federal commission to really give direction and to really look at what this means.
Right. So with H.R. 40, I believe Congressman Conyers has been proposing this for about the last 25 years.
At least.
And it's a 7-person commission, is that correct?
Yeah, I believe it's a 7-person commission, and basically it's a commission, and usually I'm opposed to just studying something, but this has never been looked at from a federal government perspective. And so this commission of 7 persons would look at first the historical context, which again the museum really lays out in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, but also what the gaps still are, and they're going to stay there. I've seen a lot of progress. I mean, when I started school, I couldn't go to school, public school, because they were segregated. I ended up having to go to Catholic school. My parents just refused to participate, even though the black school was a great school. There's no more segregation. And so you still have people who are dealing with all of the vestiges and ramifications now of slavery. And so what Congressman Conyers' commission would do would look at certain aspects of what has taken place and how to rectify and remedy that. And so we don't know what that path forward would be, but certainly we need to look at it.
Right. So this isn't the first time America has done, for lack of a better term, reparations. Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. The government apologized, and I believe they received, some received a certain sum of money. Why do you think reparations in relation to slavery is so controversial?
That's a very good question. I think a lot of people just refuse to admit that the vestiges are still here. It was several hundred years ago, but the generational aspect of it, sometimes people lose the context in which you see the mass incarceration, for example, of African American men. Oftentimes people think that we're blaming them personally and say, oh, I didn't have anything to do with it. That's not the point. This was a government-sanctioned legal institution. It's not about a personal kind of vendetta or a personal guilt thing. It's about your government that you pay taxes to, that enslaved millions of people who are still dealing with that. And so I think the debate and the commission, what it would do, would look at some of these issues and try to help people understand it's not about you personally. It's about your government and what they took part in and what they legalized and how some of those aspects of legalized slavery are still with us.
Great. So as I understand it, H.R. 40 encompasses possibilities that include an apology to some sort of compensation to descendants of slaves. As a member of Congress, what's your perspective? What do you think at this point would be the right remedies?
When you look at some communities, especially in the African American community, when you see the higher rates of poverty, when you see higher rates of disparities in health care, and when you see the mortality rates of African Americans being shorter, in terms of lifespans being shorter, when you look at housing, when you look at education, the disinvestment of education in public schools, and the dropout rates. I mean, when you look at all of the indices in the African American community, while in some areas we've made a lot of progress, and again, first part of my speech is going to talk about some of the progress we've made under President Obama. We've got to move a little faster now, and we've got to move forward. And so in Congress, targeted resources, for example, there are formulas, funding formulas, that could be targeted to specific communities that are still dealing with oppression and with the fact that people in those communities, in the South especially, are direct descendants of slavery and slaves and the slave trade. And so Congressman Clyburn, our assistant leader, has championed, and I've worked with him on a 10, 20, 30 plan with federal funds that would target resources into certain communities. It wasn't directed into African American communities because a lot of the communities have poor whites under this formula, so everyone would benefit, but formulas like that would be targeted for specific communities to help catch up. Affirmative action did a bit, But now we've got to move much forward because we're losing generations of people behind systemic and institutional racism. And so looking at the banking institutions, the wealth gap, I mean, it's huge after, the financial institutions targeted African American communities for subprime loans. Our communities lost all of their wealth. Whatever wealth, little wealth we have was in our homes. Now it's probably 6 cents on the dollar in terms of the wealth gap. So we've got to have financial institutions try to determine how they're going to rectify this so that people can live the American dream like anyone else. Otherwise, we fall further and further and further behind.
Mm-hmm. So, as virtually everyone on the planet is aware, we're in the midst of a presidential election cycle, and while it seems like we say this every 4 years, this year's races for the White House and Congress seem as rancorous and partisan as can be recalled in living memory. How do you, as a member of Congress, forward action around reparations in such a hyper-partisan climate? What is the viability, I guess I'm asking, for passing legislation related to reparations post-November 2016?
Well, as you said, Congressman Conyers has been introducing H.R. 40 for 25 years. This is a marathon. It's not something we see as happening overnight. And this election, has been an election that we've seen the bigotry, the racism, the hatred, through the likes of Donald Trump emerge. But I have to tell you, over the last 8 years, I have seen, and I say he is head of the GOP because I've seen complicity in his words and his actions. And so we have an election, I think, that should be now a referendum on bigotry. And I think through this process, through, unfortunately, the horrible things that are taking place now and that are being said, maybe after this election people might get it. Maybe more people would go to the museum in Washington, D.C. and understand that there's been so much suffering that, this speaks to the conscience of every American. And so I have to believe that the country is going to come together and will support a variety of issues and funding formulas and resources. And this will come. We just need a debate right now. We need to talk about it because, I think every issue around race has been swept from under the carpet. And in many ways, this referendum on bigotry in November should be the beginning of another debate about what we need to do to make sure that there's equal opportunity and equal justice under the law for African Americans.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. So there's been a lot of debate about gender equity and across society, of course, and here at Penn Law and in the Legal Academy and in the legal jobs market, there's been a lot of debate and talk and concern about gender equity in terms of pay and leadership and so forth. What are your insights as a lawmaker about women in leadership in American society?
Well, I have to tell you first, women in leadership changes the dynamic as it relates to every issue that we address. I don't care if it's environmental policy, energy efficiency, whether it's education, healthcare, housing, all of the big issues, business, economic growth, trade. A voice of women brings a different voice to the table. I got involved in politics through working in the campaign of Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman elected to Congress, and also the first woman and the first African-American to run for president. And she paved the way, really, for Jesse Jackson and for Barack Obama, and yes, for Hillary Clinton, to really run and break these glass ceilings. And so there are a lot of glass ceilings that must be broken. When you look at pay equity, for example, women still make 70-some cents on the dollar. African-American women and Latinas down to 60-some cents on the dollar. When you look at child care, affordable child care, paid family medical leave, we have legislation to begin to help level the playing field for women, whether they're single or married. I mean, this helps everyone. We have our saying and our theme, when women succeed, America succeeds. And so there shouldn't be, and we haven't even passed the ERA yet. I mean, we need to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And so there are many, many issues that still have to be addressed as it relates to gender equity. I work with the tech sector. My district is right next to Silicon Valley. And we're working on a variety of issues to increase parity in the tech sector of African Americans, Latinos, and people of color and women. And it's still, a lot remains, a lot of work to do. So every aspect of society, you can see that women are still behind. We've made a lot of progress. But again, I just have to say, hopefully, and I'm campaigning as a Democrat, to take back the House with our Democratic candidates so we can have Speaker Pelosi once again, who really led as Speaker on a variety of issues that included women at the table. Shirley Chisholm, I always remember her saying, she said, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And so it's time to bring that folding chair and get that justice and equality that women deserve.
Great. So what is your advice to students, to young people who strive to achieve greater equality in their lifetimes?
I'd say, well, study, get good grades, get out of school. But in the meantime, while you're in school, if you have the time, volunteer on campaigns, volunteer at homeless shelter, whatever your passion is. Get involved in the community. I did that when I was a student at Mills College and at UC Berkeley. And also, it's extremely important to work with movements. I'm a movement person. I mean, I was a community worker with the Black Panther Party. We just celebrated 50 years in Oakland this weekend. Several members from Philadelphia were there. And get involved with some movement. Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers. There's some wonderful movements of young people, such as with Selma. People forget the Civil Rights Movement was a movement of young people, of students, of young kids in the South and from the North who came down to get that Civil Rights Bill passed, the Voting Rights Bill passed, the anti-poverty programs. It was young people who did all of this. And so young people have to understand it's their future, it's them who are going to lead, and they've got to come up with new ways to do this. And so, I don't believe that, I travel around the country campaigning for our congressional candidates, and I don't believe young people are apathetic at all. I believe they're very smart. I hear their brilliance. It's that connection between what can I do to make things better, that is there. That connection hasn't been made. So it's up to us, and it's up to them to just push the envelope, just get out there and do it. And believe you me, the world would be a better place.
Well, Congresswoman Lee, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Case in Point. Good luck with your lecture tonight. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us next time.